The sun was a molten brand upon the cracked earth, searing the life from anything that dared to draw breath beneath its tyrannical gaze. Dust, finer than milled flour, coated Elara's tongue, her throat a raw, rasping passage that no longer begged for water but merely accepted its impending desiccation. Each inhalation was a fresh torment, dragging particles of grit into lungs that felt as brittle as autumn leaves. She lay sprawled, a discarded doll of ripped calico and fading hope, amidst the unforgiving expanse of the Western Territories, a landscape that cared little for the tender mercies of civilization. Her journey, begun with a reluctant heart and a sealed letter promising a future she hadn't chosen, had fractured into this nightmare of violence and abandonment. The memory was a jagged shard in her mind, the sudden, brutal ambush on the stagecoach, the guttural shouts of men whose faces were blurs of malice, the sharp, sickening crack of something breaking, perhaps her will, perhaps a bone. Then, nothing but the jolting agony of being dragged, then the horrifying realization of being left, a broken offering to the carrion birds that already circled, their shadows like hungry specters on the sun-scorched ground. How long had it been? Hours? A day? Time had dissolved into a relentless cycle of burning sun and chilling, star-strewn nights, each moment a fresh wave of despair threatening to drown the last embers of her resilience. Her fingers, scraped raw, twitched against the parched soil, a futile attempt to anchor herself to a world that seemed determined to cast her adrift. She thought of her father, his stern face softened by a rare smile as he'd pressed the travel money into her hand, his words about duty and a good match echoing hollowly in this wasteland. A good match. Caleb Taggart, the name on the agreement, a man she'd never met, a life she'd never envisioned. Now, even that unwanted future felt like a lost paradise. A faint whimper escaped her cracked lips, a sound almost too weak to disturb the profound silence. She tried to conjure an image of water, cool and clear, but the mirage shimmered and vanished, leaving only the cruel reality of her thirst. Her eyelids, heavy as stones, fluttered. This was it then? The end of Elara Vance, not with a whisper of defiance, but a choking surrender to the elements. Then, a sound. Not the rustle of a snake or the far-off howl of a coyote, but something closer, a rhythmic panting, the soft thud of paws. Hope, that tenacious weed, pricked through the layers of her despair. She tried to lift her head, a monumental effort that yielded only a fraction of an inch. A shadow fell over her, and for a terrifying moment she imagined a vulture, impatient for its feast. But the shadow was accompanied by a wet nose nudging her cheek, a warm, concerned breath against her skin. Through a slit of vision, blurred by dust and weakness, she saw him, a dog, large and rangy, with fur the color of a stormy sky and eyes like chips of amber, intelligent and searching. He whined softly, a sound of canine distress, and licked her face, the moisture a fleeting balm on her parched skin. He was not a wild creature, there was a collar, simple leather, around his neck. Where there was a dog, there might be a man. The thought, fragile as it was, sent a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor of renewed will through her. The dog barked then, a sharp, carrying sound that sliced through the oppressive silence, not once but twice, before turning his gaze expectantly towards the shimmering horizon. Elara strained her ears, listening past the roaring in her own head, past the thrum of her failing pulse. And then she heard it, distant but distinct, the jingle of harness, the plod of a horse. The dog barked again, a summons. He stayed by her side, a silent, furry sentinel, his presence a strange comfort in this desolate place. The sounds grew closer. A man's voice, low and questioning, called out to the dog. "Blue? What you got there, boy?" The world swam, a vortex of heat and pain, but Elara clung to consciousness with the last vestiges of her strength. A figure on horseback materialized out of the heat haze, a silhouette against the blinding sun. As he drew nearer, details emerged. A wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow, broad shoulders, the worn denim and leather of a working man. He dismounted, his movements economical and unhurried, and approached, the dog, Blue, trotting to his side, looking from the man to Elara and back again, as if urging him to understand. The man stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her still form. She could feel the intensity of his scrutiny even through her daze. She tried to speak, to plead, but only a dry croak emerged. He knelt, his shadow finally offering a small measure of relief from the sun. His face was still obscured by the hat, but she sensed a stillness about him, a quiet contemplation. Was this salvation, or just another form of peril? In this land, kindness was a rare currency, often counterfeited. He reached out a hand, slowly, as if not to startle a wild thing, and gently brushed a strand of matted hair from her forehead. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his fingers calloused but careful. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and the vast, indifferent hum of the wilderness. Elara closed her eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a muddy path through the dust on her cheek. She had nothing left to offer, no fight, no plea. Only the faint, stubborn pulse of life, a flicker in the encroaching darkness. The dog whined again, pressing close to her, a loyal guardian found in the heart of oblivion. The man, still nameless, still a shadow, remained, a silent witness to her desperate plight, his presence an uncertain promise against the certainty of the dying dust. The sun beat down, relentless, and the vast sky watched impassive, as one life teetered on the brink, discovered by a cowboy's dog, a fragile, broken thing in the unforgiving heart of the West, Caleb Taggart watched the woman, or what little of her was discernible beneath the grime and the ravages of exposure. Blue, his usually stoic companion, was agitated, nudging her hand with his nose, then looking up at Caleb with an expression of profound canine concern that Caleb had rarely witnessed. The dog was seldom wrong about people or situations. Caleb was a man of the land, accustomed to its harshness, its unforgiving beauty, and the brutal realities it often dealt. He'd seen death in many forms, but there was something about this woman, her stillness, the utter vulnerability in the slight curve of her dirt-stained cheek, the way her parched lips were parted as if in a silent plea, that struck a chord deeper than mere pity. He'd been tracking a stray steer, a long, hot pursuit that had led him further afield than he'd intended. Blue had suddenly veered off, barking with an insistence Caleb couldn't ignore. Now he understood. He carefully ran his gaze over her. Her dress was torn, good quality fabric but now ruined, suggesting she wasn't from these parts, not a settler's wife accustomed to the daily grind. Her hands were slender, though scraped and bloodied. No weapon lay near her, no supplies, just the desolate earth and the hovering promise of buzzards. Whoever had left her here had intended for her to die. A cold anger, familiar and tightly leashed, stirred within him. He was a solitary man, not by choice initially, but habit had made it a comfortable if lonely existence. His ranch, nestled in a small, defensible valley, was his sanctuary, a place carved out of the wilderness by his own sweat and sorrow. He didn't seek out trouble, nor did he often invite company. But to leave someone like this? It was an offense against the unwritten codes of the frontier, a cruelty that even this hard land seemed to abhor. Gently he slipped his arm beneath her shoulders, another under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight. A faint moan, softer than a breath, escaped her lips as he lifted her. Her head lolled against his chest, and he caught the scent of dust, sweat, and something faintly floral, a ghost of a perfume from another life, another world. He carried her to his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust Devil, who watched the proceedings with placid curiosity. Mounting with her in his arms was awkward, but manageable. He settled her as comfortably as he could, her body limp against his, and turned Dust Devil towards home, Blue trotting faithfully alongside. The journey back was slow, measured. Caleb was acutely aware of the woman's shallow breathing, the occasional tremor that ran through her. He didn't know who she was or what had brought her to this pass, but for now she was his responsibility. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the harshness of the day softening into the cool embrace of evening. By the time they reached his small, sturdy cabin, twilight had draped the valley in shadows. He carried her inside, the interior dim and smelling of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. He laid her gently on his own narrow cot, the only bed in the cabin. For a moment he stood looking down at her, a stranger who had, in the space of an afternoon, become an undeniable presence in his solitary world. There was a rawness to her exposed skin, angry red where the sun had burned, and her dark hair was matted with dirt and what looked ominously like dried blood near her temple. He fetched a basin of water, soap, and clean cloths. Tending to her was a task he approached with a careful, almost hesitant gentleness. He wasn't used to such intimate care, but he did what needed to be done, cleaning the grime from her face and hands, tending to a shallow cut on her forehead with a salve he kept for his own injuries. Her skin was hot to the touch. Fever. That was a bad sign. He found a relatively untorn section of her petticoat and, using it as a cloth, bathed her brow, her neck, her arms, trying to bring the heat down. She remained mostly unconscious, occasionally murmuring incoherent words, her brow furrowed in some unseen struggle. He forced sips of water between her lips, a slow, painstaking process. Blue lay by the cot, his head resting on his paws, watching Caleb's every move. As the night deepened, Caleb sat in his worn wooden chair, watching her by the flickering light of a single lamp. He thought of the letter in his saddlebag, tucked away for weeks now, a letter from a lawyer back east, detailing the terms of an arrangement made by his estranged, dying uncle. Promised bride, Elara Vance. He'd almost forgotten the name, the whole unwelcome notion. His uncle, in a fit of guilt or a bizarre attempt at legacy building, had orchestrated this, promising a portion of his considerable inheritance to Caleb if he married the daughter of an old business associate who had fallen on hard times. Caleb had scoffed at the idea, a mail-order bride, essentially a transaction. He valued his independence, his solitude. Yet, the inheritance would secure his ranch, allow him to expand, to finally be free of the constant worry of debt. He hadn't replied to the lawyer. He hadn't expected the woman to simply appear. Could this be her? The thought was absurd. The timing, the circumstance, it was too outlandish. And yet, a woman, alone, clearly from somewhere else, in desperate straits. He pushed the thought away. It didn't matter who she was right now. She was a life flickering, and he would do what he could to keep it from being extinguished. He kept vigil through the night, changing the cool cloths, offering water, listening to her ragged breathing. There was a stubborn set to her jaw, even in unconsciousness, a hint of the resilience that the JSON profile described. Towards dawn, her breathing seemed to deepen, to even out slightly. The flush on her skin lessened. He felt a small, unfamiliar stirring of relief. He was a man of actions, not words, and his actions now were focused entirely on this unknown woman's survival. As the first light of day crept into the cabin, painting the rough-hewn walls in soft gray, Elara's eyelids fluttered. Her gaze, unfocused at first, drifted around the small room, then settled on him. There was fear in their depths, confusion, but also a flicker of awareness. He met her gaze, his own steady, unreadable. He didn't speak, just watched, waiting. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the dying embers in the hearth and Blue's soft sigh. The woman, still nameless to him in any certain sense, was awake. And the quiet, ordered world of Caleb Taggart had irrevocably changed, Elara drifted in a disorienting sea of pain and fragmented memories, the harsh sun and choking dust replaced by a dim, shadowed space that smelled of wood smoke and something vaguely medicinal. Her body ached with a profound weariness, yet the burning thirst that had tormented her was eased, replaced by a dull throb in her head. She blinked, her eyelashes heavy, and the blurred shapes around her slowly sharpened. Rough-hewn wooden walls, a low ceiling, a small, stone fireplace where embers glowed faintly. She was lying on a narrow cot covered by a coarse but clean blanket. A dog, the same stormy gray creature from the desert, lay on the floor beside her, his amber eyes fixed on her with a calm, watchful intensity. Then she saw him. The man. He sat in a simple wooden chair across the small room, unmoving, his gaze steady upon her. The wide-brimmed hat was gone, revealing a face that was all harsh angles and sun-weathered lines, framed by dark, unruly hair. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were startlingly direct, holding no discernible emotion. Yet they seemed to see everything. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. Where was she? Who was this man? Her memories of the attack were still a horrifying, chaotic jumble, and for a terrifying moment, she wondered if he was one of them, if this was merely a different kind of prison. She tried to speak, her voice a dry, rasping whisper. Where? He didn't answer immediately, just continued to observe her. His silence was unnerving, a heavy blanket in the small cabin. Then his voice, when it finally came, was low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a riverbed. My cabin. You were in bad shape out there. His words were terse, offering information but no comfort, no reassurance. Elara struggled to sit up, a wave of dizziness washing over her. A sharp pain shot through her temple and she raised a hand to it, her fingers encountering a bandage. He made no move to help her, just watched, his expression unchanging. His stillness was more intimidating than any overt threat. She remembered the dog, Blue, his gentle nudges, his insistent barks. He had saved her, led this man to her. She looked at the dog, who offered a soft thump of his tail against the wooden floor. Your dog, he found me. Blue's smart, the man conceded, a slight inclination of his head. His gaze dropped to her hands, still bandaged in places, then back to her face. She felt stripped bare under his scrutiny, her helplessness acute. She was weak, vulnerable, entirely at his mercy. The pride that was so integral to her character warred with the stark reality of her situation. She needed help, but asking for it, especially from the stoic, unreadable stranger, felt like a surrender. Thank you, she managed, the words feeling inadequate. For helping me, he gave another slight nod, accepting her gratitude as if it were his due, nothing more. You need to rest. You had a fever. He rose then, his movements economical and purposeful, and went to the fireplace, adding a few small logs to the embers. The flames caught, casting dancing shadows on the walls, bringing a small measure of warmth to the cool morning air. He moved with a quiet competence, preparing coffee, the aroma filling the small space, a surprisingly domestic scent in this rugged setting. Elara watched him, trying to piece together who he was. A rancher? A trapper? He was solitary, that much was clear from the sparse, utilitarian nature of the cabin. There were no feminine touches, no signs of another inhabitant beyond him and the dog. Her gaze fell upon a small, worn pouch lying on a rough-hewn table near her cot. Her reticule. She hadn't even realized it was missing, or rather, she had assumed it lost with everything else. With a surge of effort, she reached for it. Her fingers fumbled with the drawstring, her movements clumsy. Inside, amongst a few coins and a small, silver-backed mirror, miraculously unbroken, was the letter. The letter that had brought her west, the letter that sealed her fate. Her fingers closed around the stiff parchment. The man turned, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He saw the reticule, the letter, but his expression remained impassive. He walked over and offered her the mug. Drink this. It's weak. She took it, her hands trembling slightly. The warmth seeped into her cold fingers. The coffee was indeed weak, but it was hot, and it helped to clear some of the lingering fog in her mind. She looked at the letter, then at him. The question was there, unspoken, hanging in the air between them. Who was she? And what was she doing in his territory, near death? My name is Elara Vance, she said, her voice a little stronger now. She watched his face for any flicker of recognition, any sign. There was nothing. Just that steady, assessing gaze. It was perversely disappointing. Some small, irrational part of her had wondered if he might already know, if fate had delivered her, quite literally, to his doorstep. I was on the stagecoach to Willow Creek. We were attacked. His eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Willow Creek. It wasn't far, a day's hard ride. Outlaws? She nodded, the memory bringing a fresh wave of fear. They took everything. Left me. She couldn't bring herself to say 4 dead. He absorbed this information without comment, his silence prompting her to continue. She had to make him understand, to ensure he didn't think she was a threat or a burden he would soon cast off. I was traveling to meet someone. An arrangement? She hesitated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. An arranged marriage. It sounded so archaic, so demeaning, especially now, stripped of all pretense, confessing it to this stern stranger. Caleb Taggart's gaze didn't waver. He took a slow sip from his own mug. The name Elara Vance echoed in his mind, connecting with the almost forgotten letter from his uncle's lawyer. He looked at her more closely now, trying to reconcile this battered, fragile woman with the faceless name on a piece of paper, the pawn in an old man's game. Her dark hair, though matted, would be fine, he suspected. Her features, beneath the grime and bruising, were delicate. There was a stubborn set to her chin even now. If this was indeed Elara Vance, the promised bride, then fate had a crueler, more ironic sense of humor than he'd ever imagined. He had ignored the letter, intending to let the arrangement fade into obscurity. And now here she was, delivered to him by his own dog, her life saved by his hand. The implications were staggering, unwelcome. He valued his solitude, his hard-won independence. A wife, especially one thrust upon him by circumstance and a dead man's will, was the last thing he wanted. Yet, he couldn't deny the pull of responsibility, a responsibility that now felt deeper, more complex than simply caring for a stranger. He remained silent, processing this new, unsettling possibility. His lack of response made Elara uneasy. She clutched the letter in her lap, a tangible link to a past that now seemed a world away and a future that was utterly, terrifyingly uncertain. He had saved her life, but what now? Would he take her to Willow Creek? Would he simply send her on her way once she was strong enough? The silence in the cabin stretched, filled only by the crackling fire and Blue's occasional soft sigh. Elara felt a growing sense of trepidation. This man, Caleb, if that was even his name, held her immediate future in his calloused hands. And his face, etched with the harshness of the land he inhabited, offered no clues, no comfort, only a profound, unnerving stillness. The rising sun cast longer shadows into the cabin, and with them, a growing tension. She had given him her name, her story. Now she waited for his judgment, his decision, unaware of the silent, internal storm her revelation had unleashed within him. Caleb Taggart set his mug down on the rough-hewn table with a deliberate slowness. the ceramic making a soft click in the otherwise quiet cabin. Elara Vance. The name settled in his mind, no longer just words on a page but now attached to the bruised and wary woman before him. He felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. This complicated things immensely. His first instinct after the initial shock was a familiar retreat into stoic reserve, a desire to push this unwelcome development away to maintain the carefully constructed solitude of his life. He had never asked for a wife, certainly not one delivered to him in such a dramatic, near-fatal fashion. The terms of his uncle's will had been an irritation, a problem for another day, one he had vaguely hoped would resolve itself by his inaction. Now, inaction was no longer an option. Elara watched him, her dark eyes, shadowed with exhaustion and lingering fear, searching his face for some reaction. He knew his expression was likely unreadable, a mask honed by years of self-reliance and keeping his own counsel. He wasn't a man given to easy displays of emotion, and this situation, with its layers of obligation and unforeseen intimacy, only reinforced his tendency towards silence. He walked to the small, grime-streaked window and looked out at his land, the familiar contours of the valley, the distant line of mesas under the vast, pale sky. This was his world, predictable, demanding, but his own. A wife, a stranger bound to him by a dead man's decree, would irrevocably alter its landscape. "Willow Creek," he said finally, his back still to her. "You were headed there to meet a man named Taggart." It wasn't a question, but a statement, flat and devoid of inflection. Elara's breath hitched. He knew. The realization sent a fresh wave of apprehension through her. How did he know? Was he connected to this Taggart? Or was it common knowledge in these parts, this strange arrangement? "Yes," she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Caleb Taggart. Do you know him?" He turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers. The winter sky eyes held a new intensity, a depth she couldn't quite fathom. For a long moment he said nothing, letting the silence build, a palpable thing between them. Then, with a starkness that seemed to suck the air from the small cabin, he stated, "I'm Caleb Taggart." The words fell into the quiet room with the weight of stones. Elara stared at him, her mind struggling to process the information. This man, this gruff, solitary rescuer, was the man she had journeyed across half a country to marry? The man whose name was a symbol of a future she had dreaded yet had resigned herself to? It was impossible. It was a trick of her fevered mind, a cruel jest played by fate. But his unwavering gaze, the stark certainty in his voice, left no room for doubt. A torrent of conflicting emotions assailed her, disbelief, a strange, hollow sort of relief that her journey hadn't been entirely in vain, and a profound, overwhelming sense of dismay. This was not the reunion, if it could even be called that, she had ever envisioned. She had imagined, in her more charitable moments, a stern but fair man, perhaps older, established, someone who would offer stability, if not passion. This Caleb Taggart was younger than she'd expected, harder, etched by a life that seemed to have stripped away all softness. He was like the land itself, untamed, formidable, and utterly intimidating. She felt a flush creep up her neck. The indignity of her situation was suddenly magnified. Found half dead in the dirt by her own intended husband. There was a bitter irony to it that did not escape her. "You?" she finally managed. The word a fragile exclamation of shock. He gave a curt nod, his expression unyielding. "It seems," he said, his voice dry, "you found me. Or Blue did." He gestured towards the dog, who thumped his tail again, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension. Elara's pride, though battered, began to reassert itself. She would not be a pitiable creature, a burden thrust upon him. She drew herself up straighter on the cot, wincing as her bruised muscles protested. "Mr. Taggart," she began, her tone more formal now, a shield against her own vulnerability. I don't know what to say. This is unexpected. Understatement," he grunted, turning back to the window. His silence was not just a habit, she realized, but a defense. He seemed as thrown by this revelation as she was, though he concealed it far better. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, charged with unspoken questions and the weight of their bizarre predicament. What now? The contract, the promise, her father's desperate hope for her security, it all hung in the air, an invisible tether binding them together whether they wished it or not. Caleb felt trapped. He had a duty to her, not just as a man who had found a woman in distress, but now under the terms of an agreement he hadn't sought but hadn't explicitly rejected either. He thought of the ranch, the constant struggle, the way the inheritance his uncle had dangled could ease that burden. But at what cost? His freedom? His peace? He looked at Elara again. She was watching him, her face pale but her gaze resolute. There was a strength in her, he could see it now, a resilience that had kept her alive in the desert. She was not the meek, compliant mail-order bride he might have half expected, half dreaded. This Elara Vance had spirit. And spirit, he knew, was essential for survival out here. You need to recover, he said, his tone softening fractionally. Practicalities first. The rest could wait. When you're stronger, we'll talk about arrangements. The word felt inadequate, clinical. Elara nodded, a sense of weariness settling over her again. The shock of the revelation combined with her physical weakness was draining. The men who attacked the stage, will they come looking? The fear was still a cold knot in her stomach. Caleb considered this. Possible. But this valley is isolated. Not easy to find unless you know it's here. He didn't add that he was not a man easily caught unawares. His gaze flickered to the rifle resting in the corner, a silent promise of protection. He saw the lingering fear in her eyes. You're safe here, he said, the words simple but carrying a weight of conviction. It was a promise, she realized, perhaps the first genuine one she had received in a long time. For now it was enough. She leaned back against the rough pillow he'd fashioned from a folded blanket, the exhaustion too profound to fight any longer. Her rescuer, her promised husband, this stern, silent man named Caleb Taggart. Her life had taken a turn so sharp, so unexpected that she could only cling to the hope that somehow she would find her footing in this new, bewildering landscape. Caleb watched her drift into a restless sleep, her brow furrowed. He felt a complex mix of resentment, responsibility, and a grudging admiration for her tenacity. The silence of his cabin was no longer entirely his own. It was shared now, filled with the presence of this woman, Elara Vance, who had brought with her a future he had never planned for, a future that was now undeniably, inextricably linked with his. The wind whispered around the eaves of the cabin, a mournful sound, and Caleb Taggart faced the dawning realization that his solitary life was over, whether he liked it or not. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed, but it was a path they would now, it seemed, have to walk together, days bled into a routine dictated by Elara's slow recovery and Caleb's ingrained habits. The cabin, once solely his domain, now held a subtle shift in its atmosphere, a quiet tension born of their enforced proximity and the unspoken weight of their future. Elara, regaining strength incrementally, found herself observing Caleb with a mixture of apprehension and reluctant curiosity. He was a man of few words, his communication often consisting of terse instructions or monosyllabic responses. Yet his actions spoke of a deep, if gruffly concealed, kindness. He changed her bandages with a surprisingly gentle touch, ensured she had broth or weak tea, and kept the fire stoked against the chill of the high desert nights. He never pressed her for details about the attack beyond what she had already offered, nor did he bring up the subject of their arrangement again, allowing her the space to heal both physically and mentally. His life was one of rigorous discipline, up before dawn to tend to his meager livestock, a few hardy cattle, a couple of chickens, and dust devil, then hours spent mending fences, chopping wood, or disappearing into the vastness of his land, presumably hunting or checking traps. Blue was his constant shadow, a silent, loyal companion who seemed to divide his affections now, often lying by Elara's cot when Caleb was outdoors, offering a warm, reassuring presence. Elara, confined mostly to the cot or the single chair, fought against the insidious encroachment of despair. The trauma of the attack still haunted her sleep, images of leering faces and brutal violence replaying in her mind. But the instinct for survival, the core of resilience that had seen her through the worst, began to assert itself more strongly. She started by doing small things, tidying the already sparse cabin, mending a tear in one of Caleb's shirts with thread and a needle she found in a small tin, her fingers still clumsy but determined. These small acts were an attempt to reclaim some agency, to feel less like a helpless invalid and more like a contributor, however minor. Caleb would return from his labors, his face etched with sun and wind, and find these small changes. He never commented, but she sometimes caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Approval? It was impossible to tell with a man who guarded his thoughts so fiercely. One afternoon, feeling a little stronger, she found a worn book of poetry tucked onto a high shelf. Shakespeare. It was an unexpected discovery in this rugged, utilitarian dwelling. She opened it, the pages soft and well-thumbed, and began to read, the familiar cadence of the verses a balm to her frayed nerves. Caleb entered silently, as was his way, and found her absorbed. He stopped, just inside the doorway, watching her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Elara, sensing his presence, looked up, a faint flush rising on her cheeks, as if caught in some transgression. "I hope you don't mind," she said, indicating the book. He merely grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and proceeded to prepare his supper. Yet, later that evening, as she read quietly by the firelight, she noticed he seemed to be listening, his usual restless energy subdued. The silence between them was still profound, but it was slowly changing. It was less the silence of strangers, more the quiet of two people becoming accustomed to sharing the same small space, the same air. Occasionally, a brief exchange would occur, usually practical. "Need more water?" he'd ask. Or she might venture, "The wood basket is low." These were stepping stones across a vast expanse of unspoken thoughts and feelings. Elara learned to read the nuances in his stillness, the slight shift in his posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw that signaled displeasure or worry. She learned that his gruffness was a shield, not necessarily against her, but against a world that had clearly taught him to expect little and trust less. She, in turn, began to shed some of her own guardedness. She spoke a little of her home back east, of her love for books and music, small, tentative offerings into the silence. He listened, mostly without comment, but she sensed he was absorbing it all. One evening, as a storm raged outside, the wind howling like a tormented spirit and rain lashing against the cabin, a particularly violent clap of thunder caused Elara to start, a small, involuntary cry escaping her. Caleb, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, looked up sharply. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a momentary flash of concern. He didn't say anything, but he laid the rifle aside and stoked the fire, the simple, domestic act strangely reassuring. The shared experience of the storm, the confinement it enforced, seemed to subtly alter the dynamic between them. They were two souls weathering the tempest, both literally and metaphorically. As her physical strength returned, so did a restless energy. She began to venture outside, first just to the cabin stoop, then further, exploring the immediate surroundings of the small, sheltered valley. It was a harsh beauty, the stark rock formations, the resilient scrub, the vast, overarching sky. She saw the relentless labor Caleb poured into this land, the way he fought to wrest a living from its unforgiving soil. A grudging respect began to grow within her, for his tenacity, his quiet endurance. She noticed the scars on his hands, the lines of weariness around his eyes that even his stern demeanor couldn't quite conceal. This land, and the life it demanded, had marked him deeply. One day, Blue led her to a small, clear spring hidden among a cluster of cottonwoods, a tiny oasis in the arid landscape. As she knelt to drink the cool water, she felt a profound sense of peace, a fleeting moment of connection to this wild, untamed place. She realized that despite everything, the attack, her uncertain future, the intimidating presence of Caleb Taggart, a part of her was beginning to feel, not at home, not yet, but perhaps less like an alien, an intruder. The gradual reveal of their characters was a slow, intricate dance of observation and guarded interaction. Elara's initial fear was giving way to a complex mix of respect, caution, and an undeniable awareness of him as a man, not just a rescuer or a name on a contract. Caleb, for his part, found himself increasingly aware of Elara, not as an obligation, but as a woman of quiet strength and surprising resilience. The initial shock of her identity as his promised bride still lingered, an unresolved chord in the symphony of his disrupted life, but the immediate crisis of her survival was passing, giving way to the more nuanced challenge of their shared existence. The question of what next loomed, unspoken but ever-present, a subtle cliffhanger to their unfolding story. The harshness of the land mirrored the harshness of their circumstances, yet within it, tiny seeds of understanding, perhaps even connection, were beginning, almost imperceptibly, to take root, The turning point arrived with the subtlety of a season-changing and almost imperceptible shift that, in retrospect, marked a new phase in their strange cohabitation. Elara, now mostly recovered from her physical ordeal, though the shadows of trauma still flickered in her eyes at unguarded moments, found the confines of the cabin and its immediate surroundings increasingly restrictive. Her innate resilience, that stubborn core of inner strength, chafed against her continued dependence on Caleb. She was not a woman content to be idle, to be merely cared for. She needed purpose, a way to contribute, to reclaim a sense of self-worth that had been so brutally stripped from her. One morning, as Caleb prepared to ride out, checking the cinch on Dust Devil's saddle, Elara approached him, a newfound resolve hardening her gaze. "Mr. Taggart," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I cannot continue to be a burden. I am well enough to work. Please, tell me what I can do." Caleb paused, his hands still on the saddle. He turned to look at her, his expression, as usual, difficult to decipher. He surveyed her for a long moment, taking in the determined set of her jaw, the clarity in her eyes. He had seen her growing restlessness, the way she paced the small cabin like a caged bird. He'd also noted her quiet industry, the mended shirt, the way she kept the cabin tidier than he ever had. He hadn't expected this directness, this demand to be useful. Most women of her apparent station, he imagined, would expect to be waited on, especially after such an ordeal. "Ranch work is hard," he stated, his voice flat. Not for a lady. The hesitation before lady was telling. He still saw her as someone from another world, delicate, unsuited to the harsh realities of his life. Elara's chin lifted a fraction. "I am stronger than I look, Mr. Taggart, and I am a quick learner. I will not be an ornament here. I need to earn my keep." There was a quiet fire in her voice that surprised him, a spark of the pride he'd glimpsed before. He considered her words. He could use the help, truth be told. His ranch was a constant, demanding struggle, always more work than one man could comfortably handle. But to ask her, a woman who was supposed to be his wife under an arrangement he still hadn't fully accepted, to perform menial labor, it felt wrong, somehow. Yet, her insistence was undeniable. Perhaps it was what she needed, a way to ground herself, to find her place in this alien landscape. "There are chickens to feed, eggs to collect," he said finally, his tone grudging. "The vegetable patch needs weeding. Water needs to be hauled from the spring." He listed the tasks, expecting her to balk, to realize the unglamorous reality of the work. Elara listened intently, a small nod her only response. "Show me," she said simply. And so began a new chapter. Caleb, with his characteristic economy of words, showed her the small, fenced-in chicken coop, the struggling patch of earth where he attempted to grow a few hardy vegetables, the well-worn path to the spring. He watched her as she tentatively scattered feed for the squawking hens, her movements initially awkward but careful. He saw her recoil slightly from the dirt as she knelt to pull weeds, but then square her shoulders and continue, her brow furrowed in concentration. He left her to it, riding out with Blue, a strange mixture of doubt and a nascent respect stirring within him. Elara threw herself into the work with a fierce determination. The chores were physically demanding, her muscles, still healing, ached by midday, and her hands, accustomed to books and needlework, were soon chapped and sore. But with each task completed, a small measure of satisfaction bloomed within her. This was real, tangible. This was her contribution. She learned to gather the eggs without startling the hens, to distinguish weeds from precious seedlings, to haul buckets of water from the spring, her arms straining but her spirit resolute. She discovered a rhythm to the work, a connection to the earth that was surprisingly grounding. In the evenings, exhaustion settled over her, a welcome change from the restless anxiety that had plagued her. She and Caleb still shared their meals in near silence, but the nature of that silence was evolving. It was less a void, more a shared space, filled with the unspoken understanding of a day's labor. Occasionally, Caleb would offer a curt observation. "Chickens look calmer," or "needs more water on the beans." It was his way of acknowledging her efforts, she realized, a grudging sort of praise. One afternoon, while weeding, her hand brushed against something metallic buried in the soil. She dug it out, a small, tarnished silver locket, heart-shaped, its chain broken. It was clearly old, perhaps lost long ago. She cleaned it as best she could and that evening showed it to Caleb. "I found this in the garden," she said, placing it on the table between them. Caleb picked it up, his large, callous fingers surprisingly gentle as he turned it over. A shadow crossed his face, a flicker of some deep, unreadable emotion. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She loved this valley. Tried to make a garden here." He fell silent, staring at the locket. Elara felt a pang of empathy. This was a glimpse beneath the armor. A rare insight into the man behind the stoic facade. She understood then that his solitude was not just a preference, but perhaps a fortress built around old griefs. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, the usual guard was down. She saw not just the harsh rancher, but a man who had known loss. He closed his fingers around the locket. "Keep it," he said, his voice gruff again, as if embarrassed by the momentary lapse. She'd have liked that someone found it." Elara took the locket, her heart strangely touched. It felt like a small, significant offering, A bridge across the silence. The incident subtly shifted their dynamic further. The realization of his mother's presence, her attempts to cultivate beauty in this harsh land, resonated with Elara. She found herself tending the small vegetable patch with renewed dedication, seeing it not just as a chore, but as a continuation of an older hope. As days turned into weeks, the unspoken question of their arrangement still hung in the air, but it was now overlaid with a fragile layer of shared experience, of mutual, if unacknowledged, respect. Elara was no longer just the promised bride or the helpless victim. She was becoming a part of the rhythm of the ranch, her presence slowly weaving itself into the fabric of Caleb's solitary life. And Caleb, though he would never admit it, found himself watching her more, noticing the way the sun brought out reddish glints in her dark hair as she worked, the stubborn determination in her eyes, the quiet grace that even rough work could not entirely erase. The threat from the outlaws who had attacked her stagecoach had faded into the background, though Caleb remained vigilant, his rifle always close at hand. The more immediate challenge was the one within the cabin walls, the challenge of two disparate souls thrown together by fate, slowly, cautiously beginning to navigate the uncharted territory of a shared future. The summer days grew longer, hotter, and the land demanded more. And as they toiled under the relentless sun, a silent understanding began to grow, an understanding that transcended words, an understanding rooted in shared labor, shared solitude, and the quiet, persistent hope for something more than mere survival. The climax of their personal journey was not yet upon them, but the rising action was undeniably building, a slow burn of emotional development and unspoken connection forged in the crucible of the unforgiving West, The fragile piece of their evolving coexistence was shattered one scorching afternoon, not by the return of outlaws, but by a far more insidious threat, gossip carried on the wind from the small, dusty settlement of Willow Creek. Jedediah Stone, a wiry, weather-beaten trapper who occasionally traded pelts with Caleb, rode into the valley, his eyes alight with curiosity and the news he bore. Caleb met him by the corral, his expression, as always, guarded, while Elara, alerted by Blue's welcoming barks, watched from the cabin doorway, a familiar knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. Strangers were a rarity, and their arrival seldom boded well. "Caleb," Jedediah greeted, dismounting with a groan. "Heard some strange talk in Willow Creek." "'Bout you?" Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Talk?" "Aye. 'Bout a woman. A fancy one, they say, showed up out of nowhere at your place." Jedediah's gaze flickered towards Elara, lingering for a moment too long. "Folks are wonderin'. Some say you found her near dead. Others whisper darker things." Elara felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. Societal judgment, the very thing she had hoped to avoid by her quiet recovery in this isolated valley, had found her. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Folks should mind their own business, Jed. Easy for you to say, hold up out here," Jedediah countered, though not unkindly. "But Willow Creek ain't that far. And Sheriff Brody, he's been asking questions. 'Bout a stagecoach robbery a while back. A woman passenger gone missing. Name of Vance." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. So, her identity, or at least her disappearance, was known. The fragile anonymity she had found here was dissolving. Caleb's gaze met Elara's across the dusty yard. He saw the fear in her eyes, the hunted look she'd worn when he first found her. A cold, protective anger surged through him, an emotion so fierce it surprised him. This woman, Elara, had become more than just an obligation, more than the terms of a will. She was under his roof, under his care. "She's here," Caleb said, his voice flat, challenging. "She was hurt. I took her in." Jedediah shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Caleb, I ain't judging. Just telling you what's being said. Brody's a suspicious man. And there's talk that the men who hit that stage, the Culpepper gang, might still be in the territory. They ain't known for leaving witnesses, the Culpepper gang." The name sent a fresh wave of terror through Elara. She remembered their brutal faces, their cruel laughter. The thought that they might be searching for her, the sole survivor who could identify them, was horrifying. Caleb's hand instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. His eyes, cold as a mountain stream, scanned the ridges surrounding the valley, a habit born of long years of solitude and self-reliance. "Let them come," he said softly, a deadly quietness in his tone. Jedediah, seeing the look on Caleb's face, decided not to press further. "Just thought you should know, friend. Watch your back." He accepted a drink of water, exchanged a few pelts for supplies, and rode out, leaving a palpable tension in his wake. The moment he was gone, Elara turned to Caleb, her voice trembling slightly. They know my name. If the Culpeppers are looking for me, you're safe here, Caleb reiterated, his voice firm though his eyes were troubled. This valley is defensible. And I know how to handle myself, but Elara saw the new worry etched on his face. His solitude had been his protection. Now her presence made him a target, made them both targets. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily upon her. I should leave, she said, the words costing her. I can't put you in this danger, Caleb. He looked at her then, a long, searching look. He saw not a frightened victim, but a woman of courage willing to sacrifice her own safety for his. It was a stark contrast to the self-serving nature of most people he'd encountered. You're not going anywhere, he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. This is your home now, Elara. He used her first name without the formal Miss Vance or the awkwardness of before. It was a small thing, but it resonated deeply. It was an acknowledgement and acceptance. In that moment, the unspoken arrangement seemed to solidify into something more tangible, something chosen, not just imposed. The threat, however, was real. Over the next few days, a subtle shift occurred. Caleb became even more vigilant, his movements more watchful. He cleaned his rifle and shotgun with meticulous care, checked his ammunition. He spent hours reinforcing the weak points in the old stockade fence that partially enclosed the cabin and barn. Elara, watching him, felt a mixture of fear and a strange sense of security. He was preparing for a storm, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he would defend her, defend their small sanctuary with his life if necessary. The work of the ranch continued, but it was now overlaid with a sense of impending crisis. The vast, silent landscape, once a source of solace for Elara, now seemed to hold hidden menaces. Every rustle in the brush, every distant sound, made her jump. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence thicker than usual, Caleb spoke, his voice low. Tell me about them, Elara. The Culpeppers. Anything you remember. Faces, voices, anything. Reluctantly, painfully, she recounted the horrific details of the attack, forcing herself to relive the terror, searching her memory for any detail that might help. Caleb listened intently, his expression grim, occasionally asking a terse question. As she spoke, she felt a strange sense of release, of sharing a burden that had been solely hers for too long. When she finished, her voice hoarse, he reached out, his calloused hand briefly covering hers where it lay on the table. It was a fleeting touch, over in an instant, but it spoke volumes. It was a gesture of comfort, of solidarity. We'll be ready for them, he said, his eyes meeting hers, a silent vow passing between them. The climax was no longer a distant possibility, it was a gathering storm on the horizon. The confrontation, whether with the outlaws or with the suspicious arm of the law from Willow Creek, felt inevitable. And in the face of this shared danger, Caleb and Elara found themselves drawing closer, their individual strengths beginning to merge into a fragile but determined alliance. The stoic, solitary rancher and the resilient, refined woman from the East were preparing to make their stand, not just for their lives, but for the tentative, unspoken hope of a future they were only just beginning to imagine together, The storm broke not with the thunder of hooves or the crack of rifles, but with the quiet, insistent arrival of Sheriff Brody and 2 deputies, their horses kicking up dust as they rode into Caleb's valley under the harsh midday sun. Blue, ever vigilant, announced their approach with a series of deep, warning barks, bringing Caleb out from the barn, his rifle casually in hand, and Elara to the cabin doorway, her heart sinking with a familiar dread. Sheriff Brody was a stout man with a weathered face and eyes that missed little. He took in the scene. Caleb's unyielding stance, Elara's pale but composed face, the rifle held loosely but ready. Taggart, Brody said, his voice carrying an edge of authority. Heard some troubling things. Figured I'd come see for myself. Caleb said nothing, his gaze steady, waiting. This the woman? Brody asked, nodding towards Elara. The one from the stagecoach attack? Elara Vance. She is, Caleb affirmed, his voice level. She was injured. I've been caring for her. Brody's eyes narrowed. Injured or hiding? There's a reward out for information on the Culpepper gang. And for any surviving witnesses, Elara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. He suspected her, perhaps of collusion or at least of withholding information. Sheriff, she spoke, her voice clearer than she expected. I was a victim of those men, left for dead. Mr. Taggart saved my life, Brody grunted, unconvinced. Maybe. Or maybe you cut a deal with the Culpeppers. Maybe Taggart here is sheltering a fugitive. The accusation hung in the hot, still air, ugly and venomous. Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle. You're on my land, Sheriff. And you're insulting my wife. The word, wife, slipped out, unplanned, a defensive instinct. Elara gasped softly, her eyes flying to Caleb's face. He didn't look at her, his gaze locked on Brody, but she saw the resolute set of his jaw. It was a lie, a monumental one, born of desperation, but in that moment it felt like the only shield they had. Brody looked surprised, then skeptical. Wife? Since when? Last I heard, Caleb Taggart was a confirmed bachelor. And Miss Vance here arrived under mighty peculiar circumstances to be a new bride. Our circumstances are our own business, Caleb retorted, his voice dangerously quiet. Elara is my wife. And she's under my protection. If the Culpeppers come looking for her, they'll deal with me. The deputies shifted uneasily, their hands moving closer to their holstered guns. The tension was a palpable thing, humming like a live wire. Elara knew this was a critical moment. Caleb had thrown down a gauntlet, a desperate gamble. She had to support it, make it believable. Stepping forward from the doorway, she moved to stand beside Caleb, her chin held high despite the tremor in her limbs. It's true, Sheriff, she said, meeting Brody's gaze directly. Mr. Taggart and we were to be married. The attack merely hastened things. I am his wife, she hoped her voice conveyed a conviction she didn't entirely feel. The audacity of the claim, standing beside the stern, formidable man who was, until very recently, a stranger, was terrifying. Yet there was also a strange, empowering surge within her. They were in this together, facing down the world. Brody scrutinized them both, his gaze moving from Caleb's stoic face to Elara's earnest one. He was a man accustomed to lies and deception, but there was a raw intensity in their united front that gave him pause. Perhaps it was the truth, however unorthodox. Or perhaps they were both very good actors. All right, Taggart, Brody said slowly. For now, I'll take your word for it. But if I find out you're lying to me, if you're obstructing justice in any way, he let the threat hang unfinished. And as for the Culpeppers, he continued, they were last seen heading towards the Blackwood Canyon. That's a good distance from here. But they're dangerous men. If you see or hear anything, you send word. Caleb nodded curtly. I will. Brody and his deputies lingered for a few more minutes, asking pointed questions about the stagecoach attack, which Elara answered as truthfully as she could, omitting nothing of the brutality she had witnessed. Caleb stood by her side, a silent, formidable presence. Finally, seemingly satisfied or at least willing to defer judgment, the sheriff and his men mounted up and rode away, leaving an uneasy silence in their wake. As their figures receded into the heat haze, Elara let out a shaky breath, her legs suddenly feeling weak. She turned to Caleb, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear, relief, and astonishment. You're your wife. Caleb finally looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then a rare, almost imperceptible softening touched the corners of his mouth. Seemed like the quickest way to get him off our backs, he said, his voice gruff as ever. Did you mean it, Caleb? She asked softly, the question hanging heavy between them. He held her gaze, and in the depths of his winter sky eyes, she saw something she hadn't dared to hope for, a flicker of warmth, of possession, of a truth that went deeper than the lie they had just told. The arrangement our families made, it was for marriage, Elara. He paused. I haven't said much on it. Been waiting. For you to heal. For a lot of things. He looked out over his land, the valley that was his sanctuary, now hers too. This life out here, it's hard. It's lonely. I never figured on sharing it. He turned back to her, his gaze direct, unwavering. But if you're willing, Elara Vance. I am. It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the poetic way she'd read about in books. But it was something far more real, more grounded. It was a choice, an offer made in the harsh light of day with full knowledge of the hardships and dangers that lay ahead. It was a testament to the bond that had been forged between them, in shared adversity, in silent understanding, in the crucible of near-death and unexpected salvation. Elara felt tears well in her eyes, tears of relief, of fear, of a profound, overwhelming emotion she couldn't quite name. Yes, Caleb, she whispered, her voice thick. Yes, in that moment, with the threat of the Culpeppers still a distant shadow and the judgment of the world temporarily held at bay, they stood together, no longer just a rancher and his rescued charge, but a man and a woman who had faced down their fears and, against all odds, chosen each other. The climax had been a confrontation of words, of wills, rather than bullets, but it had been no less significant. And as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, a quiet sense of peace, fragile but real, settled over them. They had made their decision. They had claimed their future. Now all that remained was to live it, together. The resolution was not an ending, but a new beginning. fraught with uncertainty but illuminated by a shared, hard-won hope. And as you stand on the precipice of your own challenges, facing decisions that might alter the course of your life, remember Elara and Caleb. Remember their courage, their resilience, their willingness to forge connection in the face of desolation. What unspoken truths are waiting to be acknowledged in your own life? What unexpected alliances might offer strength when you feel most alone? The wilderness of our lives can be daunting, but like Elara and Caleb, we too can find oases of hope, moments of profound decision that lead to new beginnings. Don't forget to like this story, subscribe for more tales of resilience and redemption, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What did Caleb's declaration mean to you? How do you think their future will unfold? Your engagement helps these stories reach others who might need a spark of inspiration, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, hope, courage, and connection can bloom.